Before the clatter of modern kitchens, before gas stoves, steel pots, sharpened knives, refrigerators, and endless shelves of ingredients, there were families in medieval Europe who cooked every meal with almost nothing. No proper pans, no ovens, no storage, sometimes not even a table. And yet, they survived. They fed children, warmed homes, shared meals that brought comfort through the coldest winters, and learned a kind of ingenuity that shaped cooking traditions still alive today. Tonight, on Boring History for Sleep, we step quietly into the humble kitchens of the past. Tiny hearths glowing in dim rooms, clay pots blackened by decades of smoke, wooden spoons carved by hand, simple meals that grew from skill, patience, and creativity rather than equipment. We'll explore how poor families boiled, roasted, baked, preserved, and stretched every grain, every root, every scrap, all with tools so minimal that modern cooks would barely recognize them as a kitchen at all. And as we drift through their quiet world, we'll discover something surprising. Much of what they did, we still do today, without even realizing it. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm journeys through forgotten corners of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what simple foods remind you of home. Before a pot could simmer, before bread could rise, before a single root vegetable could soften in heat, medieval poor families needed only one thing to begin cooking: a small fire. No stove, no chimney, no kitchen table, just a bare hearth in the corner of a single-room home, glowing quietly like the heart of the household. And from that modest glow, entire meals emerged. Simple meals, yes, but meals that kept families alive for generations, even in the harshest seasons. Imagine entering one of these homes at dawn. The room is dim, lit only by the faintest gray light sliding through a small window or a wooden shutter. The air is cool, almost cold, carrying a sharp reminder that winter is lingering outside. Everything inside the house is simple: a few wooden stools, a low table carved from rough timber, bedding rolled against the walls, a straw-stuffed mattress for sleeping, and perhaps one or two precious clay pots. But in the corner, beneath a darkened beam where smoke has stained the wood for years, lies the hearth. The hearth was no larger than a child's blanket. Sometimes it sat on raised stones. Sometimes it was just a hollowed circle in the packed earth. But it was everything. It warmed the home, dried clothing, heated water, cooked food, lit the evening, scared away animals, and brought comfort to families who owned little else. Even when poor households had almost no tools, they had the hearth. And the hearth shaped every meal. The day usually began with the slow process of coaxing the fire back to life. Families rarely had enough wood to keep a fire burning through the night, so they buried the last embers under ash before sleeping, hoping one or two would survive until morning. A mother or elder would crouch in front of the hearth at dawn, gently blowing on the buried coals, watching for the faint glow that signaled life. When the glow appeared, the fire was fed with twigs, straw, or dried weeds, anything that could catch quickly. With patience and breath, flames rose again. This quiet ritual was not just a practical act. It was a moment of connection, a gentle negotiation with the only tool the family could always count on. Modern kitchens hide their fires behind buttons and steel, but medieval poor families lived nose to flame, learning the language of heat long before learning the alphabet. Once the fire flickered steadily, the next challenge began: what to cook, and how to cook it with almost no tools. A poor family might own just one clay pot. If they were very fortunate, they had two, one for boiling and one for storing. Clay pots were treasured items. When they cracked, they were repaired with scraps of metal or coated in ash and mud to extend their life. Many families used the same pot for years, sometimes decades. The pot would blacken, its sides becoming as dark as the hearthstones themselves, and its handles polished smooth by countless hands. That pot was not just a tool. It was an heirloom, a lifeline. With only one pot, meals had to be simple. The most common dish was a thin pottage, a watery mixture of whatever vegetables were available: turnips, carrots, cabbage, leeks, onions, herbs, barley, oats, or peas. Families did not chop vegetables with knives the way we do today, because many households did not own knives suitable for food preparation. Instead, they tore vegetables by hand, crushed them with stones, or sliced them roughly with a small household blade worn nearly dull. The pieces were uneven, sometimes large, sometimes tiny, but the pot did not mind. Everything softened eventually over the heat. The pottage simmered slowly, absorbing the smoke of the fire and the flavor of the clay pot. Most days, it did not contain meat. Meat was rare and expensive, and poor families only tasted it a few times a year. But vegetables, humble, hearty, and familiar, filled the pot often enough to keep hunger softened, if not silenced. Boiling was the safest and easiest cooking method for families with limited tools. The pot hung over the fire using a simple metal hook, or it sat directly on hot stones at the edge of the flames. No temperature control existed. Families learned heat through experience, by listening to the bubbling sound, watching how quickly steam escaped, or sensing how close to the flame the pot should sit. These instincts were passed quietly through generations, forming a cooking language that needed no written recipe. But boiling was only one method available, even with few tools. The hearth also allowed for roasting. Poor families roasted food directly on the embers, a technique older than recorded history. A root vegetable could be buried in ash, roasted until soft, then brushed clean and eaten. A piece of stale bread could be reheated by placing it near the coals to crisp its edges. Even small fish or scraps of meat could be skewered on a twig and held over the fire. These methods required no pan, no grill, only patience and familiarity with the flame. Bread, although simple, was one of the most challenging foods to prepare without tools. Many poor families did not own an oven, so they improvised. They created ash cakes, dough made from coarse flour and water, flattened and placed directly in warm ashes. When cooked, the ashes were brushed away. The flavor was smoky, rustic, and comforting. Some families cooked dough on hot stones, creating a primitive flatbread. The stones were heated first, then wiped, then used as a natural griddle. Every kitchen tool had to serve multiple purposes. A single wooden spoon stirred pottage, fetched hot vegetables, mashed grains, and ladled portions into wooden bowls. That spoon was a prized possession, carved by hand and passed down like the pot. When it cracked, it was repaired. When it broke, it was mourned. Tools were not objects, they were companions. Families also relied heavily on stones. Stones to crush herbs, stones to crack nuts, stones to grind grains, stones to flatten dough. A smooth river stone could serve as a rolling pin. A heavy stone could substitute for a mortar. These improvised tools shaped every meal, reminding us that cooking is more about creativity and resourcefulness than equipment. For poorer families, preservation was equally important. They dried herbs by hanging them near the hearth. They smoked fish or meat when possible by suspending it above the fire. They buried root vegetables in cool earth or straw to keep them fresh through winter. These methods required no tools, only knowledge passed from elders to children in quiet conversations beside the fire. Even flavor came from simple sources: wild herbs gathered from fields, salt carried home in tiny cloth bags, garlic bulbs braided and hung from rafters. The flavors were subtle, earthy, honest. Poor families did not seek richness in their meals. They sought nourishment, warmth, and familiarity. Cooking was rarely a solitary task. Mothers, children, elders, and sometimes neighbors worked together. One person tore vegetables, another fed the fire, another stirred the pot. Cooking was an act of community, woven into the fabric of daily life. In these tiny homes, food preparation became a ritual that bound families together, offering comfort even when supplies ran thin. By evening, when the pottage had simmered long enough, the family gathered around the hearth, not at a table, but on stools, benches, or even the floor. They shared the meal slowly, savoring warmth more than flavor. The pot that cooked the meal became the pot that served it. Bowls were simple wooden vessels. Eating meant dipping, sharing, speaking quietly, and letting the body rest. After the meal, the pot was rinsed with cold water, scrubbed with sand or straw, and set aside for the next day. Tools were few, but they were cared for as if they were precious treasures, because they were. In the quiet of night, as the fire dimmed once again, families gathered the last embers under ash, hoping they would survive until morning. And so the cycle continued, a dance between flame, pot, hands, and hunger. A dance performed with almost no tools, and yet with endless ingenuity. What poor families achieved with so little still astonishes us today. They cooked meals without pans, roasted food without grills, baked bread without ovens, flavored dishes without spices, and fed households using nothing but the earth, the fire, and their own creativity. It teaches us something timeless and humbling. Cooking is not defined by tools. It is defined by resourcefulness, patience, and care. In the medieval world, wealthy households owned kitchen tools made of metal, wood, and even imported materials, cauldrons that gleamed, knives that sliced cleanly, pans that heated evenly. But poor families lived in a different reality, one where a single pot often did the work of an entire kitchen. It boiled, it baked, it stewed, it steamed, it brewed, it fed, and it lasted until the clay grew so thin that cracks spread like spiderwebs across its surface. This one pot was not just a tool. It was the center of survival, the object around which every meal, every season, and every family rhythm revolved. Imagine a simple medieval cottage, a single room, a dirt floor, a smoky beam running across the ceiling, straw scattered in corners, and a hearth pressed into the far wall. There are no shelves stacked with cookware, no polished metal, no iron pan hanging from the rafters, only one modest clay pot. Its edges are darkened by years of soot, its sides worn from daily use, its handle wrapped in cloth for insulation. Inside this pot, night after night, meals transformed from raw ingredients into nourishment. What makes the one-pot life extraordinary is not the pot itself, but the creativity, discipline, and timing that families applied to use it for everything. Today we cook with multiple pots, pans, skillets, and appliances. But medieval poor families relied on a sequence, a choreography, of tasks that unfolded inside that single vessel. The day often began with porridge, the foundation of countless medieval breakfasts. Grains like oats, barley, or rye were mixed with water and heated slowly. Families stirred gently with a wooden spoon, watching the mixture thicken as steam curled upward. Porridge was filling, predictable, and comforting, especially during winter. It required no seasoning, no fancy additions. Sometimes a family might add a pinch of salt. Sometimes a neighbor might offer a spoonful of honey. But usually, porridge was plain, a warm, steady beginning to the day. Once the porridge was finished, the pot was not washed thoroughly, because water was precious and soap was rare. Instead, it was wiped out with straw or a scrap of cloth. The thin residue of grains clinging to the pot would serve as the start of the next meal, a habit that modern cooks might consider unclean, but medieval families saw as efficient, even flavorful. Nothing was wasted. Later in the day, the pot transformed again, becoming a vessel for pottage, the dish that defined medieval working-class diets. Pottage was more than food. It was a system, a habit, a living recipe that changed daily. Vegetables, herbs, grains, leftover porridge, and occasional scraps from the previous night were added into the pot. The mixture simmered slowly over a modest flame. Poor families rarely had enough wood to maintain a large fire, so they learned to cook in a low, steady manner, allowing time to do most of the work. This slow simmering created a rich, comforting dish whose ingredients changed constantly, depending on what the family could gather, trade, forage, or grow. One day the pottage might include carrots and leeks. Another day it might rely heavily on cabbage or onions. On fortunate days, a small bone from a butcher might be added, offering flavor and nutrients to stretch across multiple meals. The pot never fully emptied. Each evening, a small portion remained at the bottom, to be diluted with water and expanded with new ingredients for the next day. In this way, the pot became a continuous story, a culinary timeline that reflected the seasons. In summer, fresh greens filled it. In autumn, root vegetables bulked it up. In winter, dried peas. And preserved herbs kept it alive. In spring, young shoots and foraged plants brightened its flavors. The pot witnessed all changes in the family's fortunes. Lean days, abundant days, celebrations, illnesses, and recoveries. But the pot was not only for boiling. Poor families used their single vessel creatively for steaming. They placed broadleaves, cabbage, burdock, or even large edible weeds at the bottom of the pot. On top of these, they laid roots or grains, placing a lid or cloth over the opening. The steam softened everything slowly. This primitive steaming technique created a texture different from boiling and offered variety in a world where most meals were fluid and soft. The same pot also served as a baker, in a manner of speaking. Medieval poor families had no ovens, but they could create something similar by burying the pot in embers or surrounding it with heated stones. Dough made from coarse flour and water was shaped into a round and placed inside the pot. The lid was covered with glowing embers. This created a crude but functional oven, producing dense bread with a smoky flavor. It was heavy, dark, and chewy, nothing like modern bread, but it was precious, filling, and treasured. Families also used the single pot as a brewing vessel, preparing mild drinks made from fermented grains or herbs. These drinks were low in alcohol and used primarily as safe hydration, since water quality was inconsistent. Brewing in the pot required patience. The liquids had to be warmed, then cooled, then allowed to rest. Even children drank these gentle brews because they were far safer than stagnant water. But perhaps the most ingenious use of the single pot was in preservation. When times were good and vegetables were abundant, families boiled them into thick pastes, dried them by the fire, and stored them for winter. Herbs were steeped in warm water, then dried and rehydrated through the pot as needed. The pot became both creator and keeper of food security. Using one pot also meant meals were always shared. The pot sat in the center of the room, steaming quietly, while family members gathered around it. Each person held a wooden bowl or dipped directly with a spoon. There were no individual plates. The pot was the center of the home, the center of conversation, the center of warmth. It symbolized unity, cooperation, and survival. But the one-pot life came with challenges. The pot could crack if exposed to sudden temperature changes. It could wear thin if scraped too aggressively. If it broke entirely, a family could go days without cooked food, forcing them to eat raw vegetables or stale bread. Repairing the pot was an art, using clay patches, plant fibers, or metal clamps. Every repair extended the pot's life, and every successful repair felt like a small victory against poverty. The pot also shaped daily rhythms. Families learned to time their day by how long something simmered. A slow pottage meant hours of work in the field. A quick boil meant someone was ill and needed nourishment. A thick stew meant the family had gathered enough to stretch meals through the night. And through all of this, the pot became more than a tool. It became part of the family's identity. It carried the flavors of years. It held meals that soothed sadness, celebrated harvests, or strengthened bodies after sickness. Children grew up watching their mothers stir the pot, learning instinctively when to add water, when to taste, when to feed the fire. They inherited the pot as adults, continuing the tradition. Today, we own dozens of kitchen tools. We cook on stoves, in ovens, on grills, in microwaves, using gadgets that chop, slice, blend, knead, steam, and sauté. But the medieval poor family, with only one pot, created a world of nourishment through ingenuity, patience, and a deep intimacy with the fire. The one-pot life teaches us something quiet but powerful. You do not need many tools to create comfort. You need only a vessel, a flame, and the willingness to make something with love. In the quiet interior of a medieval poor family's home, the simplest object carried the greatest power, the fire. There were no iron stoves, no chimneys that carried smoke neatly upward, no multiple pots lined along a wall. There was only a single hearth, small, smoky, and persistent, glowing like a patient heart in the corner of the room. And it was this humble flame, more than any tool, that shaped the entire world of cooking for those who had almost nothing. Wealthier households had brazier stands, metal pans, and ovens built into stone walls. But poor families lived with the bare minimum. One pot if they were fortunate, a few wooden spoons, and the fire itself. To cook with such limited tools meant developing an extraordinary sensitivity to heat. The hearth became not just a place where flames burned, but a companion that needed to be read and understood in order to prepare even the simplest meal. Every morning began with a ritual that determined the rhythm of the entire day, reviving the fire. Poor families rarely had enough firewood to keep flames alive all night. Instead, before sleeping, they buried the last glowing embers beneath a mound of ash, hoping that by dawn, a few faint orange sparks remained. When morning came, the woman of the household, or whoever woke first, knelt beside the hearth and gently blew across the ashes. If luck favored them, the embers brightened shyly, revealing their thin veins of life. If not, the family had to walk to a neighbor's home and request a burning coal to start the day's fire. In this world, flame was not a convenience. It was a lifeline, and mastering it required more skill than any tool in a modern kitchen. Once the fire began to breathe again, families began the delicate work of controlling it without the help of metal grates or adjustable surfaces. Heat could only be increased by feeding the flame, twigs first, then dried weeds, then the precious small logs collected from forests or fields. Decreasing heat meant removing fuel or spacing the embers. It was a constant negotiation, a slow conversation between human hands and the unpredictable nature of flame. Every household developed an instinctive understanding of what the fire needed. How much wood to offer, how close the pot should be placed, how long a root vegetable should roast among the embers, how to judge the strength of heat by the color of the coals alone. Cooking directly in the flames was a normal part of the day. Cabbage leaves and herbs were placed near the edges, curling slowly as they crisped. Root vegetables, turnips, onions, carrots, were buried in warm ash, then pulled out later, their skins charred but their insides soft. Children often recognized the smell of a roasted turnip long before it emerged from the embers. Bread dough, made from coarse flour and water, could be flattened and placed on a warm stone heated in the fire. The stone acted as a primitive griddle, and though the bread was tough and smoky, it was deeply satisfying. Medieval poor families had no frying pans, yet they discovered an entire world of roasting, baking, heating, and drying simply by understanding how stone and flame interacted. One of the most remarkable skills was learning how to simmer food over a fire that had no dial or setting. A pot placed directly over a flame could easily crack, especially if made of clay. For this reason, families often placed their pots slightly to the side, where the heat was lower and more consistent. Simmering became the central method of cooking because it required the least fuel and allowed food to cook gently throughout the day. As long as the fire was kept alive, grains softened, herbs infused their flavor, and vegetables slowly surrendered into tender pieces. A pot of pottage simmering quietly in the background filled the home with warmth and scent, drawing the family together even when chores kept them apart. Fire also acted as a tool for preservation. Without smokehouses or ovens, poor families relied on the hearth to cure and dry food. Fish caught in nearby streams could be suspended above the fire on sticks or thin branches, drying slowly over hours or days until safe to store. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung from beams near the hearth, absorbing just enough smoke to dry without rotting. Even vegetables could be sliced thin and placed near the fire to remove moisture. These methods required awareness and patience. Too much smoke and the food turned bitter, too little heat and it spoiled. But with practice, families cultivated an intuitive understanding of preservation long before the idea of food storage existed as we know it today. In many ways, the hearth shaped the emotional landscape of the household as much as it shaped meals. Families gathered around it not only to cook, but to warm their hands, dry wet clothing, mend tools, and talk softly at the end of exhausting days. The fire's crackling comfort was one of the few predictable comforts in a world filled with hardship. Babies were soothed beside its heat. Elders sat closest to the hearth during winter, moving only when absolutely necessary. The fire became a symbol of continuity, a gentle presence reminding the family that no matter how difficult the world outside was, this small glow belonged to them. But fire demanded respect. Without chimneys, smoke filled the room, curling upward until it seeped through small window holes, thatched roofs, or cracks in wooden walls. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, bedding, and hair. Families learned to work with limited visibility, eyes adjusting to the haze. They learned to blow carefully across embers, not too hard or too softly. They learned how to feed the fire slowly enough that would lasted, but quickly enough that food cooked. These small daily decisions determined whether the family ate a warm meal that night or went to bed hungry. Fire also required cooperation. Everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest parent, did their part. Children gathered small sticks and dried weeds. Adults chopped or traded for larger logs. Teenagers watched the pot when adults were out working. Elders ensured embers were properly buried at night. In this way, the fire formed the center of family life not just physically, but socially. It was a shared responsibility, a shared comfort, a shared teacher. The hearth also shaped the flavors of medieval cuisine. Everything carried a hint of smoke. whether from boiling over an open flame or roasting in embers. This smokiness was not a deliberate seasoning. It was the natural result of cooking without tools. Vegetables tasted earthy and warm. Bread tasted rustic. Stews tasted deep and comforting. Even water, warmed in the pot, developed a faint smoky aroma. These flavors defined home for medieval poor families, just as specific scents define memories in today's kitchens. During winter, the hearth took on even greater significance. It was the only barrier between the family and the cold that seeped through every gap in the home's walls. The fire warmed frostbitten hands and loosened stiff limbs. But winter also meant that wood was scarcer. Families learned to burn whatever they could find: small branches, dried dung, broken sticks carried by the wind. Even then, they rationed fuel carefully, prioritizing cooking over comfort. Meals cooked in winter tasted different. Thicker, richer, less fragrant, but deeply warming. The fire taught families how to adapt, how to survive on less, how to maintain hope through the darkest months. Perhaps the most poetic part of the medieval relationship with fire was the act of watching it fade at night. After dinner, after chores, after conversations, after exhaustion settled into tired bodies, the family gathered the embers together with quiet intention. They covered the glowing cores with ash, dimming them into sleep without extinguishing them fully. The ember bed looked lifeless, but beneath the pale layer of ash lived the fragile promise of tomorrow's meals. In the morning, when the ash was brushed aside and the embers glowed faintly, it felt like a small miracle each day. Cooking with fire, with no tools, no metal, no oven, and no controlled heat, shaped a world where every meal was a slow negotiation with nature. It demanded a patience modern kitchens no longer require. It rewarded attentiveness, creativity, improvisation, and humility. The poor did not see fire as a challenge. They saw it as their most trustworthy ally. And though today we cook with stoves and timers, the heart of heat, the transformation from raw to cooked, from cold to warm, still belongs to that ancient partnership between humans and flame. For many medieval families, bread was not simply food. It was the symbol of survival, the center of every meal, the quiet reassurance that even when meat was rare and vegetables had withered in winter, there would still be something warm to fill the stomach. Yet the poorest households had no ovens, no mills of their own, no flour in abundance, and often not even the proper tools to knead or store dough. And still, through remarkable patience, creativity, and deep familiarity with the land, they learned to bake bread in ways that today feel almost impossible. Bread, for them, was not crafted in a polished kitchen. It was coaxed into existence through earth, ash, stone, smoke, and human ingenuity. Imagine a poor cottage on a chilly morning. The hearth burns weakly, still waking from the night's sleep. The room smells of smoke and cold air. A family stirs slowly, stretching their limbs and preparing for the long day ahead. There is no loaf of bread waiting from the night before. In poor homes, bread did not last long enough to be stored. Each meal began with the question, do we have enough flour to make something today? Flour came not in sacks, but in handfuls, traded from neighbors, earned through labor, or milled from grains the family grew themselves. When grains were scarce, families stretched them with ground beans, peas, barley husks, or even crushed acorns to create something that at least resembled dough. The first step to baking bread was gathering the ingredients. But in poor households, ingredients meant pieces, not whole items. Grain might be stored in cloth bags or clay jars. If a family had no millstone of their own, someone, often a child, walked to a neighbor's house to borrow time on their grinding stone. Grinding grains was slow and exhausting. The sound of the grinding stone rubbing against its base became a daily rhythm, a soft, gritty scraping that could last for an hour or more, depending on how much flour was needed. But poor families rarely needed much, because they rarely had much. Every speck of flour held value, gathered with care from the edges of the grinding bowl so nothing would be wasted. Once the grain was ground, it was sifted, usually by hand, because many families lacked proper sieves. Large pieces were picked out or reground. The resulting flour was coarse and uneven, nothing like the fine flour of wealthy households. Still, it was enough to begin the ritual of making bread. Water was added sparingly, drop by drop. Kneading was done with fingertips or palms, on a wooden board if available, or directly on the table, or even on a clean section of the floor. The dough never reached the smooth elasticity of modern bread. It was hard, gritty, and sometimes bitter. But in a world where hunger was constant, it was nourishing. At this point, wealthier families would place their shaped dough into an oven. Large, stone-lined, heated earlier, perfect for baking. Poor families had none of this. Instead, they learned to create their own ovens using whatever nature offered. One of the most common methods was the ash-baked loaf, a technique so ancient and simple that it required nothing but a fire and patience. The dough was shaped into a small round or flattened disc. When the hearth's embers glowed brightly, after the flames died down and the fire became a warm bed of heat, the dough was placed directly into the ashes. A thin layer of ash was pushed over it, insulating it. Then the waiting began. The dough slowly transformed, surrounded by warmth rather than flame. Families learned the exact moment when the bread was ready, not by sight, but by scent, a deep, warm aroma rising from the ashes. When they lifted the small loaf from the embers, it was covered in soot, rough on the outside, but soft and steaming within. The outside was brushed clean, sometimes with straw, sometimes with the cook's apron. This bread was humble but beloved. It tasted of earth, smoke, and survival. Another method relied on heated stones. Families selected smooth, flat stones from riverbeds or fields and placed them in the hearth to heat. When the stones were hot enough to sizzle with moisture, dough was flattened and placed directly onto them. The sizzling sound meant the crust was forming. This stone-baked bread was slightly crisp, unevenly browned, and full of rustic flavor. It had no uniform texture, but it had a comforting warmth that brought satisfaction with every bite. Stone baking became a cornerstone of poor households' daily meals, a technique requiring no tools other than what nature offered. During seasons when families could spare a larger amount of dough, rare but possible after harvest, they created makeshift earth ovens. These primitive ovens were built outdoors. A shallow pit was dug, lined with stones, and filled with burning wood. When the stones were thoroughly heated, the ashes were cleared out, and the dough, often wrapped in leaves to protect it, was placed inside the pit. The oven was covered with earth, trapping heat inside. Hours later, the covering was removed to reveal bread that was dense, smoky, and slightly sweet. The process was long, but for families who needed to bake enough bread for several days, it was efficient. Earth ovens did not require tools, only land, fuel, and time. Another remarkable technique was bread on a stick, used especially when families had so little flour that a full loaf was impossible. Dough was wrapped around a long branch, cleaned, peeled, and sometimes soaked in water to prevent burning, and held over the fire like a rotating spit. Children often enjoyed helping with this method, turning their sticks slowly as the dough puffed and browned. This bread was light, hollow, and eaten straight from the stick. It carried the joy of a small treat, even in a life full of hardship. Bread also appeared in the form of boiled dough, especially in winter when firewood was scarce. Instead of baking, small pieces of dough were dropped into boiling water or pottage, becoming chewy dumplings that stretched the meal and filled stomachs quickly. Boiled bread required no oven, no stone, no ash, only a pot of hot water, which most households had. This method was particularly useful during famines or cold months, when grain supplies ran dangerously low. Families also used skillet-free frying, a technique that seems paradoxical but was entirely practical. Dough was placed on the inside of the pot lid if the pot had a flat metal or clay cover. The lid was heated either by placing it near the fire or covering it with embers, creating a warm surface like a primitive griddle. Though fragile and risky for the pot, this technique allowed poor households to create a thin, crispy kind of flatbread with nothing more than their pot. In all these methods, time was the invisible tool. Bread made without ovens required waiting. Waiting for fire to settle, waiting for stones to heat, waiting for embers to lose their flame. Poor families lived in rhythm with the fire, guided not by clocks, but by color, scent, and sound. The smell of dough baking in ashes or on stone was a small luxury, a moment of hope. Even children recognized it as a sign that today would not be a hungry day. Bread also carried deep emotional meaning. It represented effort, the grinding of grain, the kneading of dough, the struggle to keep the fire alive. It represented community, neighbors grinding flour together, sharing yeast scraps, or trading a handful of grain. It represented resilience, making something nourishing out of almost nothing. And when a loaf was finally ready, no matter how misshapen, smoky, or dense, families gathered with gratitude. They tore bread, not sliced it. They dipped it into pottage. They softened stale pieces in warm liquid. They saved crumbs carefully for tomorrow's meals. Bread was not merely eaten, it was honored. Even the crumbs that fell to the floor had purpose, swept, collected, fed to animals, or added to the next day's broth. Nothing from the baking process was wasted, because waste meant hunger. Perhaps the most touching part of medieval bread making was how simple tools, hands, stones, ash, earth, air, fire, became a culinary system through sheer necessity. These families invented techniques without knowing they were inventing anything. They simply needed to survive, and survival brought creativity. Bread made without tools teaches us something profound. Comfort does not require perfection. Warmth does not require luxury. And even the simplest ingredients, handled with patience and care, can become a meal worthy of gratitude. In medieval Europe, the poorest families lived with a constant awareness that every ingredient, every grain, every root, every scrap of vegetable mattered more than anyone from the outside could understand. Food was not simply consumed. It was guarded, stretched, reinvented, and coaxed into lasting as long as possible. Nothing was taken for granted, and nothing was discarded without purpose. In a world where hunger hovered around the edges of every season, the art of stretching ingredients became a quiet, uncelebrated genius. A collection of small decisions, tiny adjustments, clever substitutions, and patient techniques that transformed scant supplies into meals that could feed a family through the uncertainty of tomorrow. Imagine stepping into a poor family's cottage near dusk. The air is cool and faintly smoky. A small pot hangs above a fading fire, the liquid inside bubbling just enough to send a gentle aroma through the room. A mother stirs slowly, not because the stew needs constant attention, but because stirring helps her think, calculating what remains, how much can be saved, whether this pot must feed everyone tonight and tomorrow, or perhaps even the next day. Hunger was not a dramatic event for poor families. It was a quiet tension woven into every decision. And stretching food was a skill as essential as knowing how to start the fire. The first way medieval families stretched ingredients was by thinning everything. Meals were rarely served in their full form. A handful of barley might become a pot of pottage by adding more water and cooking it longer. A single carrot, sliced thin and simmered for hours, could perfume an entire batch of broth. Vegetables were chopped small, not to improve texture, but to create the illusion of abundance. When the pot looked full, even if it contained little nourishment, the mind could be comforted, and small bowls could be filled several times without quickly emptying the pot. A pot of pottage was never just one day's meal. It changed as the week progressed. On the first day, it might contain fresh vegetables gathered or purchased that morning. If the family had been fortunate, the dish would taste hearty and warm. On the second day, the pot was thinned with water and new vegetables, usually the least appealing ones, were added to revive it. By the third day, grains or peas were stirred in to thicken it again, creating a new meal from the same base. This rolling method of cooking ensured that the pot never truly emptied. It was replenished in small, thoughtful increments so that something, however thin, would always be available. Even leftovers could not simply be reheated, they were transformed. A scrap of bread from yesterday became a thickener today. Crumbs swept from the table were added to tomorrow's stew. Old vegetables that softened too much were mashed and stirred into the pot instead of being thrown away. Every fragment of flavor was invited back into the kitchen. Families also learned to stretch flavor itself. Herbs were dried and crushed sparingly, used in pinches so small they barely registered on the fingers. Salt, expensive and precious, was added in dots, not pinches. Onion skins, normally discarded today, were simmered for added flavor before being removed. Even the water used to wash vegetables was sometimes saved, poured into the pot for additional nutrients. The difference between a bland meal and a comforting one often depended on how cleverly families used what modern kitchens would consider waste. One of the most ingenious techniques poor families employed was double cooking. When a vegetable was boiled, the water it left behind was never thrown away. That water, now vegetable broth, became the base of the next meal. If bones were available, they were simmered not once, but multiple times until the broth was nearly colorless. Bones were a treasure. Even when stripped clean, their marrow could enrich stew for days. A single bone might feed a family for nearly a week, gradually giving up its flavor through slow, persistent simmering. Families also used layers of cooking to make small quantities seem plentiful. If the pot contained only a few root vegetables, they boiled them until soft, then mashed them into the broth so the texture felt rich. If grains were scarce, families toasted them lightly before boiling, making their flavor deeper even in small amounts. If vegetables were beginning to rot, the spoiled parts were carved away and the rest was cooked so thoroughly that texture mattered less. Stretching ingredients was not just frugality. It was a deep understanding of how flavor, heat, and texture interacted. Another subtle art was timing. Poor families understood that different foods softened at different speeds, and cooking them in stages meant nothing was wasted. Tough roots were added early in the morning to simmer all day. Leaves and herbs were added at the very end so their flavor would not fade. Grains were added slowly to absorb the broth in stages. Families often built entire meals around when ingredients should enter the pot. This careful timing allowed a dish to taste complex even when made from humble ingredients. The idea of stretching food extended beyond the pot. Bread that grew stale was not lost. It was dried by the fire and stored as hard rations to be crumbled into broth or eaten with hot water. Families toasted stale bread on heated stones, reviving it enough to chew. Crusts were ground into powder and used as a thickener. Even the ashes from the hearth sometimes played a role, mixed into dough to create a primitive alkaline effect that softened certain ingredients. When meat was available, families used every part of it. The skin might be fried directly on embers. Tendons and cartilage were boiled until they dissolved into gelatin, adding body to stews. Organs were cooked quickly, eaten immediately before spoiling. Fat was rendered over a slow flame and stored in tiny clay jars, used sparingly for months. Bones, once emptied of flavor, were dried again and repurposed as tools, stirrers, or even toys for children. Nothing that carried even a whisper of nourishment was thrown away. Stretching food also involved stretching time. Medieval poor families knew how long each food could last before spoiling and planned their meals around these limits. Leafy greens were eaten first. Root vegetables lasted longer and were saved for later days. Peas, beans, and grains were stored carefully, protected from moisture and insects. Even the way food was cut affected its lifespan. Larger pieces wilted more slowly, so they were stored intact until needed. A particularly clever technique involved foraging, which was both a supplement to meals and a skill for stretching the main ingredients further. Children gathered edible weeds, berries, and herbs from fields and forest edges. These were added to stews not for flavor alone, but to increase volume. Plants like nettles, sorrel, chickweed, and dandelion were familiar companions in the medieval diet. They cost nothing, yet they allowed families to use less of their precious vegetables. Foraging blurred the line between kitchen and nature. Both became sources of sustenance. Some families practiced fermentation, even without realizing it as a technique. Leftover grains soaked in water sometimes produced mildly sour pastes, which were used to thicken pottage or create small dumplings. Sour flavors were not unwelcome. They added variation to repetitive meals. The boundary between what was fresh and what was usable was not strict. If food smelled sharp but not rotten, it became an ingredient rather than waste. Another profound skill was the ability to extend meals emotionally. Medieval poor families ate slowly, savoring warmth rather than quantity. They used small bowls to make portions feel fuller. They served children first so adults could adjust their own portions without children noticing scarcity. They talked while eating, allowing time to fill the space where food could not. This emotional stretching of meals created a sense of sufficiency, even in times of want. Families also shared food with neighbors in a system of quiet, mutual survival. If one household found more mushrooms or received a leftover bone, they shared a portion knowing that someday the gesture would return. Sharing was not generosity, it was insurance, a way to stretch food security across multiple families rather than one. The ingenuity extended even to tools. If a spoon broke, it was reshaped. If a pot cracked, It was patched with clay and ash so meals could continue. If a wooden bowl splintered, it was bound with twine. The ability to cook depended on the ability to care for tools, because replacing them was nearly impossible. Families stretched not only their ingredients, but their tools, their hours, and their energy. And somehow, despite the constant rationing, adjusting, thinning, and reworking of ingredients, meals still held warmth. Not just physical warmth from the pot, but emotional warmth born from the effort put into every dish. The poorest families transformed scarcity into creativity and necessity into skill. Their meals were humble, yes, but they carried the essence of survival, proof that a family could take almost nothing and turn it into something that sustained life. In the end, stretching ingredients was not simply a cooking technique, it was a worldview. It taught families to see value in the smallest things, to adapt with grace, to use nature as both pantry and teacher, and to turn the everyday act of preparing food into a quiet triumph. In the poorest corners of medieval Europe, cooking tools were not purchased. They were imagined, shaped, repaired, repurposed, and treasured. Families who lived with almost nothing learned to build their own kitchens from the earth beneath them, the wood around them, and the scraps of material that drifted into their lives. If wealthy households owned iron pans, copper pots, sharp knives, and sturdy tables, poor families owned what their hands could create. Every spoon, bowl, stick, stone, and scrap held purpose. Nothing was merely an object. Everything was a tool in waiting. To understand this world, imagine a poor family's cottage. There is no shelf lined with utensils, no racks of pans, no glimmer of polished metal. Instead, the tools of daily cooking lie scattered naturally throughout the home. A smooth stone resting near the hearth, a wooden bowl, carved long ago, a spoon with a crack bound tightly by twine, a flat piece of slate used as a makeshift baking surface, a woven basket for gathering herbs. These items hold stories, not because they are beautiful, but because they have been touched by survival. Perhaps the most indispensable of all tools was the wooden spoon. Often handmade, carved slowly with a small blade or sharpened stone, it was shaped according to the needs of the household. Some spoons were long for stirring pottage over hot flames. Others were short and sturdy for mashing boiled vegetables or thickening grain mixtures. Because wood was abundant, spoons became the first and most reliable tool a poor family owned. When the handle cracked, it was wrapped with cord. When the bowl thinned, it was reshaped. A spoon might serve a family for decades, becoming worn smooth by countless meals. The wooden bowl was equally precious. Bowls held everything: dough mixtures, water, scraps of vegetables, herbs, grains, and cooked meals. Poor families rarely had more than one or two, so bowls were washed immediately after use, rinsed with a handful of water or wiped with cloth. Bowls were often carved from fallen logs or traded from neighbors who had woodworking skills. Their surfaces absorbed flavors and scents over years, carrying the faint memory of every meal they ever held. Stones served as an entire toolkit of their own. A large, flat stone acted as a grinding surface. Grains were crushed against it with a rounder stone, creating coarse flour or cracked oats. The repetitive grinding motion, slow, heavy, and rhythmic, was a familiar sound in medieval cottages, often performed at dawn or dusk. Children were taught early how to grind gently, how to guide the stone evenly, and how to collect every grain of flour so none was wasted. Stones also functioned as cooking platforms, heated in the fire and used to bake flatbreads or roast roots. Some stones became warm seats near the fire or surfaces to dry herbs. A good stone was a treasure. Families guarded them as carefully as modern households guard appliances. The knife, if a family owned one, was often their most valuable possession. But many poor families did not have a real knife, certainly not one designed specifically for food. Instead, they used a small general-purpose blade, worn down and sharpened repeatedly until it resembled a delicate sliver of metal. The knife chopped vegetables, carved wood, trimmed herbs, prepared dough, and sometimes even served as a tool for repairing the house itself. Because the blade dulled quickly, many tasks were performed without it. Vegetables were torn or crushed. Dough was broken apart with fingers. Herbs were shredded by rubbing them between palms. The knife was never used casually. It was used with intention. Pottery was another precious tool category. A single clay pot might serve every purpose: boiling, brewing, storing, even baking. But pottery was fragile, and cracks formed easily. Families repaired pots with mud, plant fibers, or metal scraps. They reinforced weak spots by wrapping them with damp clay, then drying the patches slowly by the fire. A pot that survived many years became a symbol of resilience, its surface a mosaic of repairs. Every patch represented a moment of resourcefulness, a refusal to let scarcity win. Because tools were scarce, poor families learned to adapt objects with astonishing creativity. A broken pot became a bowl. A piece of roof tile became a baking surface. A curved branch became a handle for suspending food above the fire. A flat plank became a chopping board. Scraps of cloth became strainers. Even animal bones, once cleaned and dried, became tools, used as stirring sticks, scoops, or supports in cooking structures. The hearth itself became a tool. Families placed stones to create platforms, dug small trenches in the ash to nestle vegetables, arranged wood strategically to produce hotter or cooler spots for cooking. The hearth was not a static structure. It was a flexible cooking system shaped daily depending on the meal, the season, and the available fuel. One of the most striking tools in poor homes was the hand mill, but this tool was so scarce that it became almost legendary. Only a few families possessed one. Most relied on neighbors to borrow it or used stones as substitutes. A hand mill meant faster grinding, finer flour, and more efficient meal preparation. Families who owned one often shared it as an act of community, with the understanding that favors would return in another form. A bowl of soup, a basket of herbs, a portion of berries gathered from the field. The absence of tools also shaped how children were raised. From a young age, they learned how to handle each object with care. They were taught not to drop the spoon, not to chip the bowl, not to place the pot too close to the fire. Losing or breaking a tool could change the entire rhythm of the household. A broken spoon might mean preparing meals became slower. A shattered pot might mean eating only raw foods until a neighbor could help repair it. Tools were not conveniences. They were the fragile difference between comfort and hardship. Because tools were few, families relied heavily on their hands. Hands kneaded dough, shredded leaves, stirred thick mixtures, shaped ash-baked bread, tested the temperature of stones, and checked whether vegetables had softened. Hands did what utensils could not. Fingertips learned the language of dough, whether it needed more water, whether it had rested enough, whether it was ready for baking. Hands recognized the heat of the hearth, the subtle difference between warmth suitable for simmering and heat too dangerous for a clay pot. Hands felt the texture of grains, sensed rot in vegetables, and gathered herbs with a delicacy that tools could not provide. The body itself became a part of the kitchen. Cloth, too, served as a multi-purpose tool. A single piece of cloth might be used for straining broth, wrapping dough, covering fermenting mixtures, drying bowls, holding hot stones, or polishing the pot. Even old, frayed cloths held value. They were resewn, folded, or cut into strips to become ties for tools or coverings for bowls. Nothing was wasted, because everything had a second life waiting. Poor families also made tools from what modern society considers trash. Bark became containers. Reeds became strainers. Hollowed out, gourds became ladles. Small baskets woven from twigs or grasses became sifters for grains. The natural world provided an endless supply of potential tools, limited only by the family's imagination and time. A significant part of tool-making involved repair, an art almost forgotten today. Every tool in a poor household bore scars, stitches, knots, patches, darkened areas from smoke. Repairing a tool was an act of love, not just utility. A repaired spoon carried history. A patched pot held stories. In repairing something, families repaired their sense of stability, reminding themselves that even in difficult circumstances, something broken could still serve. Over time, these handmade and repurposed tools developed personalities of their own. The spoon became familiar, the feel of its handle, the curve of its bowl. The pot became a constant companion, the way it steamed, the way it simmered. The stone used for baking developed a distinct scent. Even the bowls carried subtle flavors from past meals. Tools blended into the fabric of daily life until they felt irreplaceable, even though they were so simple. Cooking without a kitchen meant looking at the world with different eyes. A poor family did not see an empty landscape. They saw tools everywhere. A branch was not just a branch. It was a future spit for roasting. A stone was not just a stone. It was tomorrow's baking surface. A broken pot was not trash, it was a bowl in disguise. Scarcity did not limit them, it sharpened their creativity. In the end, what poor families lacked in tools, they replaced with imagination, adaptation, and the quiet skill of making do. Their meals were shaped not by gadgets or metalwork, but by patience and handcraft, by the subtle artistry of turning the world around them into a kitchen. And perhaps the greatest lesson their tools teach us today is this: a tool is not defined by its material, but by its purpose. A kitchen is not defined by what it has, but by what people can create with what they have. When we imagine medieval meals, we picture tables set with stews, bread, vegetables, perhaps even meat on occasion. But for the poorest families, those living at the fragile edge of survival, food was never guaranteed, and dinner was often an improvised answer to a simple question: what do we have today? There were seasons when the pot was full and the family went to bed warm. But there were also long stretches, especially in late winter, early spring, and during poor harvest years, when meals became less about flavor or tradition and more about necessity. These were the times when families created dishes out of almost nothing, stretching imagination as much as ingredients to fill empty stomachs without tools, without variety, and without security. To understand these meals, imagine a late winter evening in a poor medieval cottage. The wind presses against the wooden walls, whistling through cracks where straw no longer seals the gaps. The fire burns low because wood is scarce. A single pot hangs above the embers, its contents barely deep enough to cover the bottom. The family gathers close, watching the pot as if hoping the heat alone will make its contents multiply. Hunger is not dramatic, it is quiet, dull, and familiar. This is when meals of necessity emerged, cooked from scraps that would seem insignificant in more fortunate kitchens. One of the most common meals in such times was simply watered pottage. Instead of adding new ingredients, families added water. A scrap of yesterday's pottage, perhaps a spoonful of mushy grains, wilted cabbage leaves, or a few softened carrot slices, was thinned until it became a pale, watery broth. It tasted faintly of whatever had been cooked before. This practice was not laziness, it was survival. Even a weak broth warmed the belly and gave the illusion of a meal. Children drank it slowly, savoring warmth rather than flavor. Adults took smaller portions than the children, often pretending they were fuller than they were. Another necessity dish involved leafy greens and wild weeds, gathered even in the colder months. Families knew which plants remained green through winter: chickweed, bittercress, shepherd's purse. These plants tasted sharp, sometimes unpleasantly so, but they provided nutrients when gardens lay dormant. Leaves were torn by hand and boiled briefly to soften them. Sometimes they were folded into a thin porridge or added to water to make a faint vegetable broth. Foraging was a vital skill, and even the smallest leaf gathered from a forest edge felt like a blessing. In periods of scarcity, grain shells and husks became food. When grain was milled, the outer layers, the bran and husks, were usually discarded or fed to animals. But poor families kept everything. Husks were boiled, strained, and boiled again. Even though they were tough and fibrous, they produced a broth with a faint cereal flavor, enough to trick the stomach into believing a meal had occurred. The liquid thickened slightly with each round of simmering. Though almost devoid of calories, it warmed the body, and on cold days, warmth mattered as much as food. Vegetables that today would be considered inedible also found their way into medieval pots. Turnip tops, carrot leaves, radish greens, and the tough outer layers of onions. All were boiled relentlessly to soften them. If the leaves tasted too bitter, they were boiled twice. If they retained too much toughness, families mashed them into a paste and spread it onto stale bread. Waste did not exist in these households. Every part of a plant had a possible use, even if that use required long cooking and patience. Scarcity also gave rise to meal extenders, clever additions meant to make food more filling without adding actual sustenance. One such extender was bran water-thickened dough, tiny pieces of flour paste dropped in a hot water to create chewy dumplings. These dumplings expanded slightly, giving the impression of fullness. Another extender was oat chaff, shaken from storage sacks and added to boiling liquid. Chaff floated, softened, and gave texture to otherwise empty broth. These methods transformed small meals into something that at least felt substantial. There were even times when tree bark played a role in the diet. not as actual barky strips, but as inner shavings of soft trees like elm. The inner bark, peeled thinly and boiled repeatedly, created a gelatinous substance that added thickness to soups. It was not pleasant, and it was never the first choice, but it was used when needed. Such meals reflected the incredible adaptability of poor families, who saw food where others saw only hardship. In the hardest seasons, meal skipping was itself a cooking strategy. Breakfast might be replaced with warm water or herbal infusion. Lunch might be a handful of cold grains left from the previous night. Dinner became the only true meal, however small. By eating together, slowly, at the end of the day, families preserved food and maintained their emotional bonds. Eating was not merely nourishment. It was ritual, reassurance, proof that even in scarcity, unity endured. Another necessity meal was root scrap mash. When vegetables began to rot, families salvaged whatever remained. A carrot half softened at one end was trimmed. An onion sprouting green shoots was peeled. A turnip with a moldy edge was carved clean. All these scraps were boiled into mush, mashed with a wooden spoon, and seasoned only with salt, if any remained. Though humble, root mash provided warmth and fiber, and in winter, warmth alone could make a dish feel comforting. Leftover bread, hard as stone, was rarely thrown away. It became bread broth, created by boiling stale bread until it dissolved into a thick, glue-like soup. The flavor depended entirely on what the bread once contained, but even the plainest bread provided familiarity. This dish was surprisingly filling, and families often relied on it during famine years. Bread broth also gave the illusion of creaminess, an unusual texture in poor households. Some families made pebble soup, a clever trick to coax extra flavor from bones or vegetables too small to make a true broth. A smooth stone was heated in the fire, washed quickly, and dropped into a pot of water. The hot stone created rapid boiling, extracting whatever faint flavors remained in scraps. This technique did not produce a luxurious soup, but it allowed families to intensify flavor with minimal fuel. Even children understood the logic. Stones made the water dance and brought life to an almost empty pot. One of the most touching meals of necessity came from shared scarcity. Families often pooled ingredients with neighbors, one family offering a handful of peas, another sharing a wilted cabbage, another contributing scraps of grain. Together, these fragments created a communal pot that was far richer than any family could make alone. Such meals were rare but cherished. They reminded families that hunger did not isolate them. Survival depended on collective strength. Yet the most remarkable part of necessity meals was not what they contained, but the emotional resilience behind them. Poor families learned to transform tiny portions into comforting rituals. A bowl of thin pottage became a chance to sit together. A scrap of boiled greens became an opportunity to teach children foraging skills. A handful of grain husks became a lesson in gratitude. Food scarcity taught patience, flexibility, and deep appreciation for every bite. In the moments when ingredients were truly scarce, when there was no grain, no root vegetables, no scraps to salvage, families turned to time as nourishment. They delayed meals, allowing hunger to settle gently rather than sharply. They drank warm water flavored with herbs or ashes, easing the stomach. They slept early to forget hunger. They told stories to distract children. These strategies, though not meals, were part of the unspoken art of survival. Meals of necessity were not failures, they were achievements. They represented the ability to live creatively, to find sustenance where circumstances offered little, to transform scarcity into resilience. These dishes, thin, improvised, and humble, were the quiet backbone of medieval survival. And perhaps the most powerful lesson these meals teach us is this: survival is not about abundance. It is about adapting with grace, making something from whatever the world gives, and sharing what little you have so that no one eats alone. When food was scarce and tools were few, medieval poor families did not survive alone. They survived because of something far more powerful than any single ingredient: community. In villages where poverty was widespread, where winter could erase entire harvests, and where one family's misfortune quickly became everyone's concern, cooking was rarely an isolated act. It was a shared effort, a quiet partnership among neighbors, extended family, and even strangers on the road. Meals did not begin in one household and end there. They originated in fields, forests, and communal spaces, flowing between homes like warm currents of survival. To understand this deeply human aspect of medieval cooking, imagine a cluster of cottages along a muddy road. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, though not all. Some households have run out of firewood. Children gather near the edge of the forest, holding baskets woven from dried reeds. Adults bend over small plots of land, pulling at stubborn winter greens. And somewhere, inside one of the cottages, a pot simmering with whatever the family managed to find sends a faint scent drifting into the air, so faint that it barely announces itself, but strong enough to draw the attention of a neighbor who has had nothing to cook today. In this world, food was not just nourishment, it was connection. One family's pot often fed more mouths than their own. A handful of peas shared by a neighbor meant an extra serving of warmth. A wilted cabbage offered across a doorway could stretch a meal by another day. The poorest families understood instinctively that survival depended on collective effort, not isolated struggle. The origins of meals in poor communities often began long before anything reached the pot. Foraging was rarely done by a single household. Instead, groups of women and children walked together, searching the edges of fields, forests, and hedgerows for edible plants. The rhythm of their footsteps became a kind of quiet song through the countryside. They gathered nettles, dandelion leaves, mushrooms, berries, chickweed, and wild sorrel. Though these plants grew unpredictably, they were reliable enough that groups formed small social circles around the act of foraging. Children learned which plants to avoid by watching others. Elders shared knowledge handed down across generations. And with every handful of herbs or greens collected, the community's meal grew richer. The same was true for hunting small animals or trapping birds, activities that poor families could only rarely participate in because tools and permission were limited. When someone succeeded in catching a bird or hare, it was often divided among multiple families, not out of generosity alone, but because the act of sharing created a kind of unspoken contract. When we have something, you will not go without. And when you have something, neither will we. This bond made the difference between hunger and hope. Cooking itself was often a communal act. Even though most families had only one pot, there were times when multiple households gathered their ingredients to create a single, larger meal. On cold evenings, when firewood was especially scarce, families might gather in one home to share both warmth and fuel. It was more efficient to burn one fire than three. The largest pot in the group, sometimes borrowed from a neighbor, was placed over the flame. Into it went everything: chopped vegetables, scraps of grains, dried beans, withered greens, and whatever herbs could be spared. The meal that emerged had no single owner. It belonged to everyone who contributed, everyone who stirred it, everyone who arrived with a bowl in hand. These communal meals served another purpose. They strengthened social ties. Sitting around a single hearth, families shared not only food but stories, worries, laughter, and quiet comfort. Children played near the fire. Adults exchanged news from nearby villages. Elders offered wisdom. The pot in the center simmered like a symbol of unity. For a moment, hunger felt smaller, and the cold world outside seemed less unforgiving. Another important aspect of shared cooking was task division. Poor communities instinctively practiced a form of cooperative labor. One family grew better onions. Another had access to a patch of wild herbs. Another knew how to dry vegetables efficiently. Another had older children strong enough to grind grains. Instead of every household struggling through every task, people leaned on each other. Grinding grain, a physically demanding job, was sometimes done by teenagers from several families at once, each taking turns with the heavy stone. Foraging groups divided the forest into zones. Collecting firewood became a group effort, both for safety and efficiency. These shared tasks did more than lighten workloads. They created a sense of belonging. Even scarcity itself was shared. When one family admitted they had nothing left to cook, the admission did not bring shame. It brought action. A neighbor might offer a bowl of thin pottage. Another might bring a handful of dried peas. Someone else, with nothing to spare, might still offer time, helping rebuild a broken pot stand, patch a roof leak, or gather reeds for basket weaving. Everything became interconnected. Poor families survived not because they had enough, but because they had each other. At times, communities practiced shared preservation. During summer and autumn, when greens, roots, and fruits were more abundant, Groups processed food together. They dried herbs by hanging them from communal lines stretched between cottages. They sliced root vegetables to dry near shared fire pits. They preserved berries in baskets lined with leaves, then stored them in cool cellars dug beneath certain homes. These preservation efforts meant that no single family bore the entire responsibility for preparing for winter. Even the poorest households contributed something: labor, time, or space. And in return, they received a portion of the preserved food. One of the most moving traditions among poor households was the practice of the traveling pot. When a family experienced illness, injury, or loss, neighbors prepared extra food and delivered it in a shared pot that rotated from home to home. After eating, the pot was cleaned and passed to the next household in need. This simple system ensured that those who could not cook still received warm meals. The pot became a symbol of solidarity, a reminder that no one in the community faced hardship alone. The emotional power of these shared meals cannot be overstated. They represented trust, compassion, and shared vulnerability. They softened the harshness of poverty by reminding people that hunger was not an individual burden, but a collective journey. Feeding one another became a way of affirming life. Even the smallest gesture, a neighbor handing over a scrap of dried cabbage, a child sharing a handful of acorns, became an act of sacred significance in a world with so little abundance. Stories from medieval villages often highlight that poor families were at their strongest when they embraced togetherness. A single family facing starvation might feel despair. A group of families facing starvation together became a force of resilience. They rotated their resources. They rationed collectively. They kept track of who needed help and who had help to give. These practices were so deeply woven into daily life that they occurred without formal rules, without laws, without obligations, only shared humanity. Cooking in these communities was not defined by ingredients or tools, but by relationships. Meals were shaped by the hands that gathered herbs, the voices that shared advice, the children who carried baskets, the elders who remembered where roots grew best in early spring. Food became an expression of shared survival, so deeply ingrained that people rarely spoke of it explicitly. They simply lived it. And perhaps the most beautiful truth is this: even when ingredients were scarce, cooking together allowed flavor to bloom. A pot filled with small contributions tasted richer not because of its contents, but because of the unity behind it. A meal shared between families carried warmth that no spice could replicate. The poorest medieval families teach us that cooking is not only an act of feeding the body, it is an act of feeding the spirit. It is a reminder that scarcity becomes bearable when shared, that burdens feel lighter when carried together, and that even the humblest meal can become meaningful when eaten among people who care for one another. And so when supplies ran low, when firewood dwindled, when winter tightened its grip, poor medieval families survived not through abundance, but through community kitchens built without walls, without wealth, without tools. Only hearts willing to share what little they had. As we reach the end of this gentle journey into the kitchens of medieval poor families, one truth rises softly above everything else we have explored. Survival was never about tools, nor about abundance. It was about ingenuity, patience, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. They cooked with almost nothing. No ovens, no pans, no sharp knives, no stocked shelves, no silverware, often not even enough food to feel full. And yet, they found ways to make meals. They coaxed warmth from dying embers. They shaped bread from earth and ash. They invented tools from branches, stones, cloth, and whatever nature gave them. They stretched scraps into soups, scraps into broths, broths into meals, and meals into memories that kept families alive during the hardest winters. What they lacked in equipment, they replaced with creativity. What they lacked in resources, they replaced with community. What they lacked in variety, they replaced with deep understanding of fire, grain, plants, and the rhythms of the seasons. They remind us that cooking, at its core, is not a performance of luxury, but an act of care, a moment of hope, a human necessity transformed into a quiet expression of love. From the simplicity of the hearth to the resourcefulness of the one-pot life. From meals born of scarcity to meals strengthened through community. From tools handmade by necessity to flavors shaped by survival. Their lives whisper a message that still feels timeless. You do not need much to create something meaningful. You need only what you have, and the heart to use it well. Thank you, dear listener, for walking through these peaceful chapters. If this journey helped you relax, taught you something new, or simply brought you a sense of calm, please consider supporting this channel by liking the video, subscribing for more soothing historical stories, leaving a comment about which chapter resonated most with you. Your support helps keep these gentle worlds alive. Sleep well, traveler. Until our next quiet story, good night.